The human nose is an amazing tool. We are capable of distinguishing a trillion shades of sense, but there is one that is hardwired into our DNA as an alarm signal. We recognize it without any experience, instinctively, at the level of the reptilian brain. John Sharp was no forensic expert, just an ordinary resident of quiet F Street in Sacramento. But when, in October 1988, the wind carried a heavy, sweetish wave from the direction of his neighbor's house, something inside him tightened. He brushed the thought away. Nonsense. That's Dorothea Puente's house, the same Dorothea the whole block knows. A small, neat woman looking like a typical innocent old lady, always wearing makeup, always in a clean dress. She runs a boarding house for poor souls with nowhere else to go, lonely seniors, the formerly homeless, people who had fallen out of the system. A saintly woman, if such a thing even existed. Surely a cat had died under the porch, or a rat, or there were problems with the septic tank. The house was old, a Victorian. Everything had a reasonable explanation, but the explanation couldn't be found, and the smell wouldn't go away. With each passing day, it grew thicker, more persistent. It seeped through closed windows. It soaked into the clothes hanging in the yard. John found himself holding his breath as he passed house number 126. He found himself looking for reasons to return home by another route. He still didn't want to call. It felt like a betrayal, snitching on an elderly neighbor who spends her life helping people, over some smell. She manages a whole house of boarders by herself as it is. Why cause her unnecessary trouble? By November, there was no choice left. The emergency operator took the call as usual. Address, the nature of the request, contact information. John spoke in an apologetic tone. He explained that his neighbor was a wonderful person, that he felt very awkward, that he was sure it was some domestic problem. He just wanted someone to check, just in case. The dispatcher classified the call as a welfare check, a routine wellness check. Low priority, no urgency. A patrol crew would stop by the address when a window opened up between more important calls. This call sat in the queue for almost 24 hours. When the police finally parked near the Victorian house with its well-kept front garden, they expected to spend about 15 minutes on the check. Knock, talk to the owner, maybe look in the basement, make sure everything was fine, close the case and move on. They didn't know that in the coming days, this address would become known to all of America. That journalists from across the country would flock here, that under the blooming roses and neatly trimmed lawn, a find awaited them that would rewrite California's criminal history, and the sweet grandmother who treated her neighbors to cookies would turn out to be someone entirely different from who everyone had taken her for all these years. If you had typed Dorothea Puente's name into a search engine in the mid-80s, if such a search engine had existed then, of course, you would have found only good things. Articles in local newspapers about her charity work, photos from city events, letters of appreciation from Sacramento social services. In archival photos, she's always smiling. A short, plump woman with neatly styled grey hair, pearl earrings, a modest dress, an embroidered apron. The type that in America is called everybody's grandma. Here she is handing out hot soup in a line for the homeless. Here she is posing with the mayor at the opening of a community center. Here she is receiving a certificate of appreciation from some non-profit organization. In every picture, the same facial expression. Warm, inviting, absolutely safe. The neighbors on F Street could talk about her for hours, and they did later When journalists flooded the block, every single one of them repeated the same thing. A wonderful woman. A real angel. We don't know what the neighborhood would have done without her. She appeared here in the early 80s. She bought this large Victorian house and turned it into a boarding house. Not a typical one where rooms are rented to tourists or business travelers. No, Dorothea took in those whom no one else wanted to take in. Homeless seniors, veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, people with mental health issues whose families had surrendered them to the system and forgotten them, alcoholics trying to quit, those who had fallen out of life and couldn't get back up on their own. Sacramento social workers adored Dorothea. She solved problems that no one else wanted to solve. When another poor soul ended up on the street without documents, without money, without the slightest idea of how to live on, they were sent to F Street. To Dorothea, she would handle it, and she did handle it. She gave people a room, she fed them 3 times a day, home-cooked meals, no processed foods. She helped restore their documents. She filed applications for social benefits and pensions on their behalf. She made sure they took their medication on time. An ideal system, an ideal hostess. The residents paid her from their benefits. This was official and legal. Not the full amount, of course. Dorothea took a percentage for room, board, and care. She gave them the rest for pocket money. At least, that's how it looked on paper. The neighborhood police knew her too. She treated patrol officers to coffee and cookies when they drove by. She passed on information about suspicious individuals. She called an ambulance if one of her residents felt unwell. An exemplary citizen who never caused any trouble. There were, of course, oddities, but no one paid attention to them. The residents in Dorothea's house changed suspiciously often. One moved to relatives in another state. Another found a job and moved out. A third simply disappeared. But what can you expect from a former homeless person? They are unpredictable anyway. That was how Dorothea herself explained it, and no one saw any reason not to believe her. Sometimes neighbors noticed her digging in the garden at night. No poželim ľuďom často nie spится. But elderly people often have trouble sleeping, and Dorothea loved her roses so much. Her front garden was one of the best kept on the entire street, a true oasis among typical American lawns. Then there were those strange mounds in the backyard, small elevations in the ground, covered with fresh soil and planted with flowers. Dorothea said they were compost heaps, or places where she buried kitchen waste for fertilizer. Eco-friendly and practical. No one asked unnecessary questions. Why bother? Her sweet grandmother is tending her garden. What's suspicious about that? The patrol officers who arrived on that November day didn't expect anything special either. A routine check, a complaint about a smell, most likely plumbing issues or something under the porch. 20 minutes of work max. Dorothea met them on the porch before they even had a chance to knock, as if she were waiting. She was smiling that same smile from the newspaper photos. She invited them in, offered them coffee. The officers explained the reason for the visit. Neighbors are complaining about a smell. We need to check if everything is okay. Dorothea nodded understandingly. Oh, that. Yes, she was aware of the problem. An old house, old pipes. The sewage has been acting up for several weeks. She called a plumber, but he just threw up his hands. It needs a major overhaul, and that's big money. For now, she's managing with whatever she has at hand. And the fertilizers. She uses organic fertilizers for the garden. Bone meal, fish emulsion. The smell is specific, of course, especially when it's warm. But what can you do? She fundamentally refuses to use chemicals, only natural stuff. It all sounded perfectly logical. The officers exchanged glances. An elderly woman, plumbing problems, organic gardening. The story checked out. They could close the call and move on. But one of them still asked to inspect the yard, just for the record, to have it noted in the report that the check was carried out in full. Dorothea froze for a second. It was barely noticeable. An ordinary person wouldn't have paid attention. But police are trained to catch such micro pauses. This tiny glitch in a perfectly rehearsed performance, and then she smiled again and said, "Of course, no problem." Come on, she'd show them everything herself. They went out into the backyard, a well-kept lawn, flower beds, garden rows, those same suspicious mounds covered with fresh earth. The smell here was stronger, much stronger. One of the officers stopped at a small elevation near the fence. He knelt down. He touched the earth with his hand, loose, dug recently. He looked up at Dorothea. She continued to smile, but something in her gaze had changed. The smile didn't go anywhere. No tepe v nej pojawiły что-то новое, сталь. But now something new appeared in it, steel. Dorothea Puente knew her rights perfectly. When the officer suggested inspecting the basement and other areas of the house, she gently but firmly refused. No warrant, no entry. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, protection from unreasonable searches. She would, of course, love to help the police, but the law is the law. The patrolmen looked at each other. Formally, she was absolutely right. A welfare check is a check on the well-being of residents, not a search. They could inspect what was in plain sight. They could talk to the owner, but breaking into the house without permission or a court warrant was an abuse of power. Dorothea stood on the porch, her arms crossed over her chest. Still the same neat woman, still the same polite manner of speech, but her eyes looked cold and calculating. She was waiting to see what they would do next. The officers did the only thing they could at that moment. They returned to the car and filed a report. Check completed. The owner of the house explained the source of the smell as sewage problems and the use of organic fertilizers. Access to the premises was not provided on legal grounds. No grounds for immediate detention were identified. A routine document, one of hundreds that passed through the station every week. It was filed away and forgotten for a while. But the universe, it seems, had other plans. Around the same time, Judy Moyes came to the Sacramento Social Services office. A social worker with 20 years of experience, she oversaw difficult cases, people who couldn't take care of themselves, and one of her charges was causing her increasing concern. Alvaro Montoya, 52 years old, a Vietnam veteran with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, alcohol problems, periodic memory lapses, a man who couldn't handle even basic things like paying bills without outside help. A few years ago, Judy had placed him in the boarding house on F Street with the very same Dorothea Puente, whom all the city's social services knew and valued. An ideal solution. Alvaro got a roof over his head, regular meals and supervision. His disability allowance covered the living expenses. Everyone was happy. Judy visited him every few months. Ordinary bureaucratic routine. Но в последний визит что-то пошло не так. But on the last visit, something went wrong. She arrived at F Street in early November. Dorothea opened the door with her usual friendliness. When asked about Alvaro, she answered easily and naturally. He had left to relatives in Mexico. He had wanted to visit his family for a long time, and finally he got around to it. No, she didn't know the exact address. No, he hadn't left any contact information. He left suddenly, literally in one day. This seemed strange to Judy. Alvaro Montoya was not a man capable of spontaneous decisions. He struggled to even go to the store on the next street, and the idea that he had independently organized a trip to another country looked implausible. She didn't argue, but she noted the information. The following weeks gave her no peace. Judy tried to find at least some trace of her ward. She checked if his checks were being cashed. It turned out payments were regularly arriving and someone was collecting them. But who? After all, Alvaro himself was supposed to be in Mexico. She called the Social Security Administration. They confirmed payments were continuing and someone was receiving them regularly. The signature on the documents was Alvaro Montoya, or something very similar to it. Judy dialed the number of the house on F Street. Dorothea answered with the same sweet voice. No news from Alvaro. Maybe write to his sister in Mexico City, although she wasn't sure if the address was current. Something was wrong here. Judy felt it intuitively, with that sixth sense that develops in those who work for years with the invisibles of society. Too smooth, too convenient, and those checks that someone continues to cash even though the recipient is supposedly abroad. She filed an official missing person report. The station took the report without enthusiasm. The missing person was an adult male with a history of alcoholism. Such people disappear all the time. They go on benders, end up in other states, sleep under bridges. But when one of the detectives noticed the address, Fasson 26 F Street, the situation changed. He had seen this address somewhere before. A search of the archive turned up the recent patrol report. Complaint of a smell, welfare check, refusal to inspect. The same Dorothea Puente. Two unrelated events suddenly formed a disturbing picture. A complaint about a characteristic smell and the disappearance of a resident, a landlady hiding behind the Fourth Amendment, and the missing man's checks being stolen by someone. Detective John Cabrera from the Major Crimes Unit took the case. He knew how to see patterns. Looking up the history of the house, he discovered that in recent years, several people had left or disappeared from Puente's boarding house at once, some to relatives, some in search of work, but none of them had contacted social services again. Cabrera prepared a warrant request. The judge, having studied the totality of the facts from financial fraud to neighbor complaints about nighttime digging, gave the go-ahead. The search warrant was signed on November 11, 1988. The next morning, detectives and forensics teams arrived at house number 1426. They had the right to search every inch of that territory. Dorothea Puente met them on the porch. This time, she had no opportunity to refuse. The detectives went into the house and the team with tools headed to the backyard to those same strange mounds covered with fresh earth. On November 11, 1988, at 8:30 a.m., Detective John Cabrera and his team arrived at 1426 F Street. The case file contains the exact timeline of that day. Every action was recorded, minute by minute. The first thing Cabrera noted in his report was the heavy smell of bleach and chemical cleaners. The house had been cleaned so thoroughly that this in itself aroused the suspicion of experienced investigators. Victorian buildings of this age usually hold decades of organic smells, but this one smelled as if it had been disinfected before a sale. Dorothea Puente met the investigative team in the living room. According to the testimony of Detective Terry Brown, who kept the record of the inspection. The hostess behaved calmly and cooperatively. She offered the police tea and inquired about the expected duration of the procedure. Throughout the search, the woman never raised her voice or showed visible signs of nervousness. The inspection of the interior took about 2 hours. Forensics checked all 17 rooms of the house, took surface samples for laboratory analysis, and seized financial documents, medical records of the residents, as well as receipts for the last 5 years. A total of 11 boxes of materials were collected. At that point, nothing overtly criminal had been discovered. The rooms looked lived in, and the residents' personal belongings were in their places. There were no signs of a struggle or biological samples visible to the naked eye. Although laboratory analysis would later show the presence of blood in several places, at that hour, the house seemed impeccably clean. At 10:45, the group went out into the backyard. The plot occupied about 600 square meters and included a well-kept lawn, rose beds, and a small vegetable garden. The report of forensic scientist Stephen Romero recorded that 7 areas with clear signs of recent excavation work were found on the territory. These zones differed from the rest of the yard. The earth on them was loose and sunken. Some mounds were covered with fresh sod, others planted with annual flowers. Dorothea explained their presence as the creation of compost pits and the burials of pets belonging to her residence. Detective Cabrera ordered the areas to be checked with a metal probe. At 11:20, forensic scientist Romero inserted the tool into the first mound, located 3 meters from the back porch. At a depth of about 90 centimeters, the tool met the resistance of a soft object of significant size, which was too large for an animal and too non-uniform for ordinary garbage. At 11:32, a team of forensic anthropologists was called. Excavations began at 12:15 under the direction of Dr. Gary Stewart. The work was carried out by hand in layers of 5 centimeters, with mandatory photographing of each stage. At 13:07, at a depth of about a meter, a shovel discovered a fragment of fabric, presumably part of a bedsheet or a blanket. Despite partial decomposition, the fiber structure was preserved enough for identification. 20 minutes later, the first bone fragments appeared from the earth. Dr. Stewart recorded the discovery of human remains in the protocol, the sex and age of which required laboratory determination. The condition of the find indicated a burial dating from several months to several years. At 13:40, Detective Cabrera officially declared the area a crime scene. By 14 lights, about 20 onlookers and 3 film crews had gathered near the house. News of the excavations on F Street spread through the city extremely quickly. According to the documents, Dorothea Puente remained on the porch, watching the forensic scientists work with an expression of detached curiosity. When Cabrera informed her of the discovery of human bones, she merely shrugged and stated her complete ignorance of their origin. According to her, the house had changed hands many times, and these could be historical burials she had nothing to do with. By 17 Wakal, the team had discovered 2 more areas with similar signs. At 17:30, Dorothea turned to Detective Cabrera with a request to let her go to the store for groceries for the residents' dinner. The detective found himself in a difficult situation. Formally, Puente was not detained, and the find in the garden was not yet direct evidence of her personal guilt. Allowing her to leave, Cabrera sent Junior Detective Bill Johnson after her with instructions to conduct covert surveillance. Dorothea put on a grey coat, a beige hat, took a leather bag, and headed toward downtown. Detective Johnson followed her at a distance of 50 meters. By 21 war, forensic anthropologists had fully exhumed the remains from the first burial. However, the main news of that evening did not come from the garden. At 22:15, Detective Johnson informed the dispatcher that he had lost sight of the subject in the crowd at the Sacramento bus station. The woman, who had successfully imitated the appearance of a frail 78-year-old grandmother, had dissolved into the evening bustle of the city and vanished in an unknown direction. The news of losing the surveillance target reached Detective Cabrera at the moment he was standing over the third excavated area in the garden. Forensics had just extracted more remains from the ground, this time in a state of much more advanced decomposition. Apparently, the burial was at least 2 years old. Cabrera listened to Johnson's garbled report over the radio. Then he slowly took off his gloves. He looked at the house, at the rose beds, at the neatly trimmed lawn under which, apparently, several more burials were hidden. A 59-year-old woman, having successfully created the image of a frail old lady, had just fooled the entire Sacramento Police Department. The next few hours were some of the most tense in the history of the city administration. All patrols were called up. Train stations, the airport, and bus stations were notified. Dorothea Puente's photo was sent to all neighboring counties, but the elderly lady in the grey coat seemed to have vanished into thin air. Meanwhile, excavations continued on F Street, and the deeper the forensics dug, the clearer the picture became. By midnight that same day, the remains of 4 people had been extracted from the garden. By the next morning, 2 more. Each burial was arranged according to one scheme. A shallow pit, remains wrapped in cloth, a layer of lime to mask the smell, and on top, fresh earth and flowers. Someone had done this systematically, professionally, over many years, and this someone had unlimited access to the backyard of house number 1426. Detective Cabrera pulled up all available materials on Dorothea Puente. What he discovered made him finally regret the decision to let her go for groceries. Dorothea Helen Gray, that was her maiden name, was born in 1929 in Redlands, California. Her biography read like a textbook on social pathology. An alcoholic father, early loss of both parents, childhood in orphanages and foster families, first marriage at 16 unsuccessful, second likewise, and a third. But the most interesting part began later. In 1961, Dorothea was convicted of activities of a dubious nature in Sacramento. Probation. In 1978 for check forgery and fraud with state benefits. 5 years in prison, released early for good behavior. In 1982, fraud again. Another 3 years. And everywhere, the same signature. Dorothea found vulnerable people. The elderly, the lonely, those with mental problems. She gained their trust. She got access to their finances. And then, these people, for some reason, disappeared or left under unexplained circumstances. In April 1982, one of her former residents, Ruth Monroe, died from a drug overdose. The investigation established that shortly before this, Dorothea had become the manager of her finances, but direct evidence of involvement was not found then. The case was closed as a suicide. Another case, Everson Gilmuth, a 67-year-old retiree. He planned to marry Dorothea in 1986, but soon his lifeless body was found in a box by the Sacramento River. At the time, the investigation decided it was an accident or an unidentified crime, not linking it to Puente. Now, looking at these materials in the context of the excavations on F Street, Detective Cabrera saw a completely different picture. Not a series of accidents, not a chain of coincidences, but a methodical, cold system that had worked for decades. Dorothea Puente got rid of people for their social security checks. The scheme was simple and effective. She took in borders people without families, without connections, without anyone who would look for them. She helped them file for benefits, pensions, disability payments. She became their trustee. And then these people quietly disappeared, but their checks continued to arrive at 1426 F Street. Dorothea forged the signatures. She cashed the payments. She explained to neighbors and social workers that her residents had moved to relatives or found a job in another city. No one asked unnecessary questions. Who cares about homeless old people? And those who could no longer bring in income, or those who began to suspect something she buried in the backyard, under the roses, under the compost heaps, under the tomato beds, for years. Now this woman was somewhere at large. With money, Cabrera had no doubt she had a stash for a rainy day. With colossal experience, she had more than once come out unscathed after serious charges, and with a full understanding of what faced her this time. In the state of California, the death penalty was the punishment for multiple premeditated crimes with aggravating circumstances. Cabrera put Dorothea Puente on the federal wanted list. Her photo appeared in all police stations on the West Coast. Local TV channels ran her portrait on the evening news. Newspapers came out with screaming headlines about the crime grandmother from Sacramento. But Dorothea seemed to have vanished into the ground. Not a single signal, not a single lead. A woman who had been deceiving everyone around her for half a century had disappeared again, only this time the stakes were significantly higher. And on F Street, they continued to dig. On November 12th, they found the 7th burial, then the 8th. The count was no longer in units. Forensics began to use ground-penetrating radar to determine how many more burials this well-kept garden hid. The scan results showed anomalies in several more points. The house, which neighbors considered an oasis of mercy, turned out to be a burial site, and its owner, one of the most cold-blooded serial killers in California history. All that remained was to find her. While the police combed the city in search of the fugitive, the Sacramento County Forensic Laboratory worked around the clock. The remains from the first burial were delivered for examination on the night of November 12th. By the morning of the 14th, the investigation had a name: Leona Carpenter, 78 years old. She had spent the last years of her life in Dorothea Puente's boarding house, where social services had sent her after the woman lost her home. She had no relatives, no friends either. Leona's only source of income was a pension and a disability allowance, about $700 a month. 3 months ago, Leona stopped showing up at the local church she had attended every Sunday for 20 years. The pastor got worried and called F Street. Dorothea replied that Leona had supposedly gone to Texas to distant relatives. The pastor believed it. Why would a sweet old lady lie? Now Leona was lying on the table in the morgue, or rather, what was left of her. Identification was carried out by dental records, the only reliable method in cases of severe decomposition. Medical services kept records of elderly patients, including data on dentures, and the match in this case was 100%. Forensic medical examiner Dr. Gary Stewart wrote the primary conclusion. Establishing the exact cause of what happened to Leona turned out to be extremely difficult. The soft tissues, had almost completely decomposed. However, several details immediately caught his attention. Traces of a chemical substance were found on the bones. Laboratory analysis showed a high concentration of calcium hydroxide, common slaked lime, the same kind used in construction, agriculture, and, as it turned out, to accelerate organic decomposition and mask the characteristic smell. Dorothea knew what she was doing. She didn't just bury her victims, she used methods that made subsequent examination as difficult as possible. Lime destroys tissue and destroys traces of many substances in the body, making it almost impossible to quickly determine the cause of death. But even lime couldn't hide absolutely everything. In the stomach cavity of one of the remains found later, experts would find traces of flurazepam, a powerful sedative from the benzodiazepine group. This is a drug that in large doses causes respiratory depression and cardiac arrest, especially in elderly people with poor health. The picture was becoming clearer and clearer. Dorothea likely slipped the sedative into the food or drinks of her boarders. They fell asleep and never woke up. Quietly, without a struggle, without visible traces. And then she carried them out to the backyard, buried them under the roses, and continued to embezzle their checks. But these were conclusions the investigation would make later. In those November days of '88, the main task was to determine the true scale of what had happened. On November 14th, ground-penetrating radar was brought to the site, a device that allows for scanning the soil to a depth of several meters without excavation. The operating principle of the device is based on sending radio waves into the ground and recording their reflection from objects of different density. Voids, stones, metal objects, all this is displayed on the screen as anomalies. Human remains also give a characteristic signature, especially if they are wrapped in thick cloth and sprinkled with lime. GPR operator Michael Terrell began scanning from the perimeter of the plot and gradually moved toward the center. What he saw on the monitor made him stop and recheck the device settings. Anomalies were practically everywhere. Under the rose bed near the eastern fence, under the tomato patch, under the decorative pond that Dorothea, according to neighbors, had installed 2 years ago, under the old apple tree in the corner of the plot, even under the concrete path leading from the porch to the shed. Terrell counted at least 9 points with characteristic signs of soil non-uniformity. 9 in addition to those burials that had already begun to be opened. Cabrera looked at the printout of the scan results and tried to process what he saw. This well-kept garden, these neat flower beds, this model front garden, all of it was a hidden burial ground. Dorothea Puente had turned her backyard into a mass gravesite and lived among them for years. She watered the flowers growing on the remains. She harvested from the beds above them. She invited neighbors for tea and treated them to baked goods while the garden, keeping its terrible secrets, was visible outside the window. The scale of cynicism amazed even the most seasoned investigators. Excavations continued for several more days. By November 18th, the remains of 7 people had been extracted from the ground. A total of 9 episodes were involved in the case at that time. Identification went on in parallel, and with each new name, the picture became increasingly grim. Dorothy Miller, 64 years old, a former nurse with alcoholism problems, entered the boarding house in '86 and had been listed as missing since the spring of '87. Benjamin Fink, 55 years old, a veteran with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, received a disability pension, disappeared in the summer of '88. His checks continued to be cashed right up to the day of the search. James Gallup, 62 years old, a former carpenter who lost his job due to injury, had lived at Dorothea's since '85. Neighbors remembered him, a tall, stooped man who liked to sit on the porch. Then he disappeared somewhere, and Dorothea told everyone he had returned to his native Oregon. Alvaro Montoya, the very person whose disappearance had triggered a full-scale investigation. His remains were found in the far corner of the plot, under a young plum tree that Dorothea had planted the previous spring. And so on. Name after name, story after story. Each of these people had come to F Street in search of help. Each had trusted a woman who seemed the embodiment of kindness, and each had ended their journey in a shallow pit in her backyard. The investigation established that at least 30 people had passed through the Puente boarding house in the last 5 years. The whereabouts of many were unknown. Some could indeed have left, but given the finds in the garden, this version looked less and less convincing. The question was how many of these missing people lay under the flowers on F Street, and how many, perhaps, were buried somewhere else, in places the investigation did not yet know about. But before looking for new burials, it was necessary to find the person who had arranged them. Dorothea Puente remained at large for the 4th day, and every hour of her absence increased the chances that she would disappear forever. Detective Bill Johnson would remember that day for the rest of his career. The moment he realized he had lost the subject of his surveillance became one of the most humiliating in his professional life. It all began quite ordinarily. Dorothea left the house at 10:45 on the morning of November the 12th, just as she had arranged with Cabrera. A grey coat, a beige hat, a leather shoulder bag, a typical elderly woman going about her business. Johnson followed her at a distance of half a block, trying not to draw unnecessary attention. For the first 15 minutes, everything went according to plan. Dorothea strolled leisurely down F Street toward the city center. She stopped at shop windows, adjusted her hat, and even waved to an acquaintance on the opposite side of the street. Nothing suspicious. Then she turned onto 16th Street and headed purposefully toward the bus station. Johnson grew wary. The grocery stores she had mentioned were in the other direction, but he assumed she had decided to stop at the pharmacy near the station or a newsstand. Who knew what business an elderly woman might have downtown? He continued to follow her at a safe distance. The Sacramento bus station in the late 80s was a typical transportation hub for a mid-sized American city. Not too large, but busy enough, especially in the morning hours. Dorothea entered the main hall. Johnson followed, maintaining his distance. In a crowd of several dozen people, the woman in the grey coat didn't particularly stand out. There were at least 5 or 6 others like her, and that was when Johnson made a fatal mistake. He was distracted for a second, literally for a few moments, to check the schedule on the board, to see where she could theoretically be heading. When he looked back toward the ticket counters, the grey coat was gone. Johnson quickened his pace, walked through the entire hall, looked into the ladies' room, asking an employee to check the stalls. He circled the platforms and questioned the cashiers to see if an elderly woman in a beige hat had bought a ticket. No one had seen anything, or they hadn't paid attention, or they simply didn't want to talk to the police. Dorothea Puente had vanished. Later, analyzing the events of that day, the investigation would reconstruct an approximate picture of her escape. She didn't buy a bus ticket immediately. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she exited through a service door on the opposite side of the building and got into a taxi. The taxi driver, who would be found a few days later, identified her from a photograph. He drove the passenger to the Amtrak train station in the suburbs. She paid in cash, gave a generous tip, and asked him not to rush, claiming that her legs were sore and she didn't handle bumps well. Just an ordinary, sweet grandmother. Nothing suspicious. At the Amtrak station, her trail went cold. Surveillance cameras were a rarity in those years, and the ones that existed produced such a blurry image that identifying anyone was practically impossible. The cashiers didn't remember her, or they remembered too many similar women to pick out a specific one. Dorothea could have gone anywhere, south to Los Angeles, north to Portland, or east across the country. The rail network covered most of the states, and tickets back then could be purchased for cash without presenting identification. When Cabrera received news of the lost target, he realized two things. First, Dorothea had prepared for her escape in advance. Her request to go to the store was not a spontaneous decision, but part of a clear plan. She knew that sooner or later the police would find the burials and had prepared her escape routes. Second, the very fact of her flight was practically an admission of guilt. Innocent people do not disappear through a station service exit while under police supervision. That same evening, Cabrera initiated federal search procedures. There were grounds for this: the discovery of human remains on the suspect's property and an attempt to flee. By the morning of November the 13th, Dorothea Puente's photograph was posted in every police station in California. By evening, the bolo, be on the lookout, had gone out nationwide. The FBI joined the investigation as the presumed crossing of state lines turned the case into a federal one. Agents checked airports and bus terminals, tracked card transactions, although everyone understood that Dorothea had likely stocked up on cash. The press picked up the story instantly. Headlines screamed about the death house landlady and the garden of horrors. Television channels showed footage of the excavations on F Street, interviews with shocked neighbors, and archival photographs of a smiling Dorothea at charity events. The contrast was so striking that the story captured the imagination of the entire country. A sweet old lady who helped the homeless turned out to be a serial killer with burials in her backyard. It was like the plot of a horror movie, except it was actually happening. Meanwhile, Dorothea had disappeared. 5 days, then a week, no leads. A woman who was 59 but looked all of 78, who complained of arthritis, seemed to have vanished into thin air. The investigation began to consider the possibility of accomplices who might be hiding her. Disappearing so completely alone seemed almost impossible. But Dorothea Puente had spent her whole life doing the impossible. She had deceived social workers, the police, and her own victims for decades. Evading the police of an entire state was perhaps not her most difficult task. However, even the most cold-blooded criminals have weaknesses. And Dorothea's weakness would be discovered entirely by chance, 700 kilometers from Sacramento, in the bar of a cheap Los Angeles motel. While all of California's police searched for the fugitive, work on F Street did not stop for a single hour. Forensics continued to methodically examine the plot, and with each passing day, the scale of the discoveries became increasingly terrifying. By November 15th, the count of discovered remains in the garden grew. Ground-penetrating radar showed that this was not yet the end. Anomalies were recorded in places the crew simply hadn't had time to reach, under a concrete path, under the foundation of an old shed, even under the porch of the house itself. On November 16th, the decision was made to partially dismantle an annex to the main building. Under its floor, more remains were found. They were in significantly worse condition than those first extracted from the garden. Judging by the degree of decomposition, they had been there for at least 3 to 4 years. All the finds were united by one detail. Each burial was organized according to the same scheme. The remains were wrapped first in sheets or bed linen, then in several layers of plastic wrap. On top, they were generously sprinkled with slaked lime, and finally a layer of earth and some object on top for camouflage, flowers, a garden bed, or a decorative stone. This was not an impulsive crime. Someone, and this someone, clearly knew what they were doing, had developed an efficient system for hiding evidence and applied it again and again over many years. Parallel to the excavations, another group of investigators studied the contents of 11 boxes seized from the house on the first day of the search. And here, the picture finally began to come together. Dorothea Puente's bookkeeping was strikingly detailed. Folders with neat labels contained copies of documents for every lodger who had ever lived in the boarding house. Applications for social benefits, payee appointment forms, powers of attorney for financial management, and medical certificates. Everything was organized so carefully that any social services inspector would not have had a single extra question. But investigators are not social workers. They looked at the documents from a different angle. Detective Terry Brown was the first to notice a pattern. She laid out the folders in chronological order and began cross-referencing dates. The day the lodger moved in, the date the power of attorney was issued to Dorothea, the time of the last contact with a social worker, and the date of the last check-cashing operation. The picture was horrifying in its simplicity. A typical cycle looked like this. A person moved into the boarding house. A few weeks later, Dorothea secured the right to manage their finances, usually under the pretext that the lodger could not handle the bureaucracy themselves. Social services approved this, as Puente was known as a caring landlady. And then the person disappeared. To social workers, Dorothea said they had moved away. To the mailman, that they had moved in with relatives. To the neighbors, that they had found a job. But their checks kept coming, and someone was cashing them regularly. Investigators pulled bank records for the last 5 years. The amounts were not astronomical, from $500 to $1,200 a month per person. Social security benefits, disability pensions, veteran payments, individually modest sums. But in aggregate, considering the number of lodgers and the duration of the scheme, it amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Detective Cabrera calculated, in recent years alone, Dorothea Puente had illegally received at least $150,000. This was the money of people who now lay in her garden. The motive was established, cold, calculating, absolutely rational. Dorothea did not commit her crimes out of hatred or in a fit of madness. She did it for profit, methodically, like a business. Her victims were ideal targets, people without families, without friends, without anyone who would come looking for them. Those whose disappearance would surprise no one. Dorothea found them through social services, which directed these people to her themselves. She gave them a roof over their heads, fed them, and became the only person close to them. And then, once she had secured all the necessary paperwork, she disposed of them and continued to take their money. Some victims, judging by the documents, generated income for years after their disappearance. Checks arrived, Dorothea cashed them, and social services asked no questions. An almost perfect crime. Almost because the smell eventually gave her away. Too many burials on a small plot. The lime helped, but it didn't perform miracles. At some point, the earth simply stopped hiding what was buried in it. By November 20th, the excavations were officially completed. The final count, 7 human remains on a plot of 600 square meters, including 2 other victims linked to Puente earlier. The case numbered 9 episodes. 7 people who trusted a sweet elderly lady ended their journey under rose bushes. Almost everyone in the garden was successfully identified. 2, however, remained unidentified for a long time. Their dental records were not immediately found in databases. Perhaps they were homeless people who had never seen a doctor. The investigation suspected that the actual number of victims could be higher. Over years of operation, dozens of people had passed through the boarding house. Where did the others go? Did they really move away? Or were they hidden in places the police didn't know about yet? Only Dorothea Puente herself could answer this, but she was still at large. 700 kilometers separated her from house number 26, and she had no intention of returning. However, human nature was already preparing the finale. In a cheap Los Angeles motel, a lonely woman passed her evenings in the bar, ordering gin and tonics and talking to random patrons. She made a mistake that cost her her freedom. While Dorothea Puente drank gin and tonics in a Los Angeles bar, the Sacramento County Forensic Toxicology Lab struggled with the main question of the investigation. How exactly did she do it? How did a 59-year-old woman, who looked like a frail old lady, manage her victims, some of whom were large and physically strong men? The answer came on November 21st, when Dr. James Beatty completed a painstaking toxicological analysis of tissues extracted from the F Street burials. The work was delicate. The lime that Dorothea had generously sprinkled over her victims corroded organic matter and erased many chemical traces, but not all. There are substances that have a tendency to eat into bone, tissue, and hair, remaining there as invisible witnesses even after the complete decomposition of soft tissues. Dr. Beatty used mass spectrometry, a technology that allows for the isolation of minute traces of chemical compounds. Bone tissue samples were ground to dust, dissolved in reagents, and passed through an analyzer. The results were cross-referenced with a database of known poisons and medications. In most of the cases studied, the device gave a clear result: flurazepam. Trade name, Dalmane, a powerful benzodiazepine that in the 80s was considered the gold standard for sleeping pills. The drug was prescribed for severe insomnia, and it was frighteningly effective. Just one pill plunged a person into a deep, dreamless sleep for 8 to 10 hours. But flurazepam also had a dangerous downside. In large doses, it caused depression of the respiratory center. A person simply fell asleep and gradually stopped breathing. The drug became especially dangerous for elderly people with weakened bodies, and these were exactly the people who made up Dorothea's flock. The concentration found in the remains was many times higher than the therapeutic norm. Dr. Beatty recorded in his report that this was a dose capable of leading to irreversible consequences for a healthy adult. For exhausted elderly people with their chronic illnesses, such a portion of Dalmain was fatal. The picture of the crimes on F Street took on a sinister clarity. Dorothea didn't need to use force. She didn't need to struggle. She simply mixed the sedative into the food or drinks of her lodgers. They fell asleep and never woke up, quietly, without screams, without a struggle, without unnecessary evidence. It was an ideal method for a predator who preferred to operate from the shadows. Investigators returned to house number 1426 with a new warrant. Now the target was medications, and they found exactly what they were looking for. In the bathroom on the upper floor, in a cabinet behind the mirror, empty packages of Dalmain were found. The prescriptions were written out to different people, the lodgers of the boarding house, who now lay in the morgue. Dorothea, as their official guardian, had every right to obtain these medications at pharmacies, but the lodgers themselves clearly weren't swallowing these pills. In the kitchen, another detail awaited the experts. On a shelf stood an old coffee grinder, which Dorothea had apparently turned into a miniature factory. Lab analysis confirmed. Microparticles of flurazepam remained on the blades. The scheme was honed to automation. Dorothea ground the sedative into powder and mixed it into evening tea or dinner. Her famous home cooking, which everyone around her admired, was merely bait. The victims ate the poisoned food, felt a pleasant drowsiness which seemed perfectly normal to them after a hearty meal, and went to their rooms. And at night, their breathing became increasingly rare and shallow until it stopped completely. By morning, Dorothea would find the lodger in bed. To any doctor, this would look like a natural passing in one's sleep. But Dorothea didn't call doctors. She waited for darkness, carried the person to the backyard, and buried them under yet another flower bed. And then she continued to cash their social checks as if nothing had happened. Pathologist Dr. Gary Stewart noted in his report, none of the skeletons showed signs of trauma. This fit perfectly with the poisoning theory. Dorothea chose a method that left no external traces. If anyone had raised an alarm, a standard examination procedure would have revealed nothing suspicious. She knew how the system worked, what questions officials asked, and what answers made them leave her alone. Detective Cabrera, reading the results of the expertise, finally realized the scale of this tragedy. Before him was not just greed, it was a professional, cold system. Dorothea Puente created a zero-waste cycle. The state itself supplied her with victims, paid for their maintenance, and when they ceased to be profitable, she disposed of them while retaining their income. A cycle that could have lasted for decades, if not for the smell that broke through the earth. Now the investigation had everything: motive, method, evidence. All that was missing was Dorothea herself. By that time, she had been on the run for 5 days, and while detectives studied traces of poison in a coffee grinder in Los Angeles, fate itself was already setting a trap for her. A lonely woman in the Royal Viking Hotel bar did not yet know that her need for conversation and a gin and tonic would become the final chapter in her criminal biography. Charles Wilgus was the kind of man often called a loser. 67 years old, divorced, without a steady job. He spent most of his time in cheap motel bars, nursing a beer and striking up conversations with other lonely patrons. On the evening of November 16th, 1988, he was sitting in the bar of the Royal Viking Motel on the outskirts of Los Angeles. The establishment lived up to its name, a pretentious title for a shabby dive with sticky tables and a TV above the bar. The evening news was on. A report from Sacramento excavations in some backyard police tape, journalists with microphones. Charles wasn't really listening until they showed a photo of the wanted woman. An elderly woman, grey hair styled in waves, a soft face, a friendly smile. Charles choked on his beer. He had seen this woman here, in this very bar, yesterday evening. They had even talked. She introduced herself as Donna Johansson and said she had come from San Francisco to visit relatives, a sweet grandmother who ordered gin and tonics and complained about arthritis. The announcer's voice reported that Dorothea Puente was suspected of a series of crimes, that human remains had been found in her garden, that she had fled from the police and could be dangerous. Charles looked at the photograph again. Then he looked around. The woman wasn't in the bar, but he remembered for sure that she was staying at this motel. She had mentioned it herself. Charles spent the next few minutes in agonizing reflection. Calling the police was a serious step. What if he was wrong? What if it was just a similar-looking woman? He didn't want to look like an idiot who raised an alarm over a coincidental resemblance. On the other hand, the screen talked about burials, about multiple victims, about how the criminal was extremely dangerous. Charles finished his beer, left the bar, and found a payphone. The call reached the Los Angeles Police Department at 21:30. The duty officer listened to the rambling story about the woman from the news who was supposedly living at the Royal Viking Motel. The information was passed to the detectives working on the bolo from Sacramento. The first reaction was skeptical. Over 5 days of searching, the police had received hundreds of calls from citizens certain they had seen Dorothea Puente in supermarkets, at bus stops, in parks, in churches. Not a single tip had panned out yet. People saw what they wanted to see or what they feared, but it was still worth checking. 2 detectives drove to the address. The Royal Viking Motel looked exactly as they expected. A 2-story building with peeling paint, a parking lot for a dozen cars, a neon sign with burnt-out letters. The manager, a tired man in his 40s, confirmed that yes, an elderly woman was indeed staying there. She had registered a few days ago under the name Donna Johansson, paid in cash a week in advance. Quiet, polite, no problems. The detectives asked for the key to the room. Room 302 was on the 2nd floor at the end of the corridor. The officers approached the door and listened. Silence. One of them knocked. After a few seconds, the door opened. On the threshold stood an elderly woman in a robe and slippers. Grey hair, a soft face, tired eyes. She looked at the policeman without the slightest surprise, as if she had been waiting for this visit. The detective introduced himself and asked her name. The woman replied that she was Donna Johansson from San Francisco. She had come to visit her daughter. Had something happened? Her voice was calm. No nervousness, no panic. Perfect composure. The officers explained they needed to ask a few questions. They asked permission to enter. The woman shrugged and stepped aside, letting them into the room. The room was small and cheaply furnished. A bed, a nightstand, a TV on a dresser. The grey coat, familiar from the descriptions, hung on the back of a chair. A beige hat was on the nightstand. One of the detectives asked the woman to produce identification. She threw up her hands and explained that her bag had been stolen at the bus station. All her documents were in it. She was just about to go to the police to report the theft. The story sounded plausible, but something didn't add up. The detectives exchanged glances. Then one of them took a photograph, printed from the bolo, out of his pocket. He placed it on the table in front of the woman. She looked at the picture. Then she raised her eyes to the policeman, and she smiled, that same soft, disarming smile that her neighbors in Sacramento knew so well. The game was over, and she knew it. The woman confessed that she was indeed Dorothea Puente. She said she was tired of running, that she knew sooner or later they would find her. She asked for only one thing to be allowed to change before they took her away. She didn't want to appear in public in a robe. The detectives agreed. While she changed in the bathroom, they searched the room. In a suitcase, they found about $3,000 in cash, the remains of the stash she had obviously prepared for her escape. There were also several pairs of glasses and a makeup kit with which she likely planned to change her appearance. Dorothea emerged from the bathroom in a neat dress and jacket. Her hair was combed. Her makeup was on, ready for her last public appearance. When she was handcuffed, she did not resist. She did not cry. She did not scream about her innocence. She simply walked calmly down the motel corridor, descended the stairs, and sat in the police car. The only thing she asked was not to tell the journalists about her arrest until she was delivered to the station. She didn't want to be filmed by cameras looking like that. The request, of course, was not honored. By the time the car pulled up to the Los Angeles Police Department, reporters were already crowding there. Flashes of cameras, shouts from journalists, microphones thrust toward the car window. Dorothea Puente walked through this chaos with her head held high, still with that same soft smile on her face, as if it were not the shameful capture of a fugitive criminal, but a grand entrance on a red carpet. On November the 17th, 1988, 5 days after her escape, Dorothea Puente was officially arrested. She was charged with several counts with special circumstances, charges that in California carried the capital penalty. But before the case would go to trial, the investigation still had much work to do. They needed to identify all the victims, establish the circumstances of each episode, and gather an ironclad evidentiary base. And Dorothea Puente, despite her arrest, clearly had no intention of making that task any easier. While Dorothea Puente was being extradited under heavy guard from Los Angeles back to Sacramento, Detective Cabrera hardly left the archives. He felt intuitively that the story of this woman could not have begun on F Street. Something in her behavior, that icy calm, that years perfected mask of virtue, suggested to him that the roots of her crimes went much deeper than they seemed at first glance. And he was right. Dorothea Puente's criminal record read not like a random collection of misdeeds, but like the professional chronicle of a calculating manipulator. Her first documented conviction dated back to 1961, activity of a questionable nature in Sacramento. Back then, she was only 32, using the surname of her third husband, and she got off with probation. Even then, she knew how to negotiate with the system. Next followed 1978, forging checks and defrauding government benefits. The scheme was practically identical to the one the investigation had uncovered now, only on a much smaller scale. Dorothea secured powers of attorney from elderly people and cashed their payments. 5 years in prison, of which she served 3, and was released early for exemplary behavior. In 1982, she was in the dock again. Fraud again, other people's checks again, and elderly victims again, who didn't even notice their money was missing. Another 3 years behind bars. Cabrera noted a frightening pattern. Each time, Dorothea chose the same target: lonely elderly people, people with mental problems, those who, due to circumstances, could not stand up for themselves. And each time she used the same tool: absolute, boundless trust. She wormed her way into people's lives, became indispensable to them, and then robbed them blind. But were crimes against life a new stage in her career? Cabrera dug deeper and found a case that made his blood run cold. April 1982. Just a few months before Dorothea went to prison for another fraud, a woman named Ruth Monroe was found dead in her apartment. 61 years old, a widow suffering from deep depression after the loss of her husband. The official cause: an overdose of medication. The case was closed as a suicide. The main witness in the case was her close friend and neighbor, Dorothea Puente. Cabrera pulled the files of that investigation, and the picture that emerged from the pages of the old reports was painfully familiar. Ruth Monroe had met Dorothea a few months before the incident. They had grown close quickly, two lonely women, both in need of company and support. Dorothea helped Ruth with housework, cooked for her, and kept her company during long evenings. And then Ruth suddenly transferred part of her savings to Dorothea as a thank you for the care. As she explained to the notary, $3,000. 2 weeks after this, Ruth was discovered in her apartment with no signs of life. Beside the bed stood an empty bottle of codeine, a painkiller she had been prescribed for chronic pain. She left no note. Police interviewed Dorothea, and she said that Ruth had been very depressed lately, saying she didn't want to live and complaining about her health. Investigators accepted this version without question back then. Why doubt the words of a caring neighbor? But now Detective Cabrera saw the case very differently. A drug overdose, a lonely victim, a recent transfer of money to Puente, and a total lack of witnesses. Everything matched the MO identified on F Street. Cabrera prepared a motion for exhumation. Ruth Monroe's grave was in the Sacramento City Cemetery, in a section for lonely people without relatives. The judge, having studied the investigative materials and seeing the similarity in methods, signed the permission. On November 23, 1988, a crew of workers opened the grave. The coffin was in relatively good condition. The dry soil had slowed decay. The remains were taken to Dr. Beatty's lab. He faced a monumental task, finding traces of poison after 6 years. The analysis took several days, and the results confirmed the worst fears. Traces of flurazepam, the same sedative from F Street, were found in Ruth Monroe's bone tissue. The concentration was lower than in fresh samples, but still detectable. This discovery changed everything. Dorothea Puente had begun committing her crimes long before she opened her last boarding house. Ruth Monroe was her trial run before turning it into a mass operation. And if the investigation had made a mistake then, how many other such cases had gone unnoticed? Cabrera ordered the review of all cases of suspicious deaths in Puente's circle over the last 15 years. It became clear. Dorothea was not just a fraudster. She was a serial criminal with years of experience who had remained invisible to justice for years. Her victims were perfect targets, people whose passing surprised no one. How many there actually were, perhaps no one will ever know. But those 9 people whose names now figured in the case finally had a chance for justice. The video recording of that interrogation is preserved in the archives of the Sacramento Police Department. Black and white film, grainy picture, muffled sound. But even through these technical limitations, The main thing is visible: Dorothea Puente's absolute, almost inhuman calm. November the 20th, 1988. An interrogation room in the main police building. Grey walls, fluorescent lighting, a table bolted to the floor. At the table, Detective John Cabrera and his partner, Terry Brown. Opposite them, the woman whom the whole country had already dubbed the Death House Landlady. Dorothea looked as if she had come for an interview at a charity organization. Neat hair, modest makeup, hands folded calmly on the table. She smiled that same smile that her neighbors and social workers knew so well. Welcoming, warm, absolutely fake. Cabrera began with the formalities. He read the rights, made sure the suspect understood them, and asked if she was ready to answer questions without a lawyer. Dorothea nodded. She saw no need for legal help, at least not at that moment. The first questions concerned her biography: where she was born, where she lived, what she did. Dorothea answered willingly, sometimes even at length. She talked about a difficult childhood, about failed marriages, about a desire to help people. She presented herself as a victim of circumstances who had tried to do only good all her life. Then Cabrera smoothly transitioned to the boarding house on F Street. Dorothea explained that she had opened it solely out of the best intentions. She wanted to give shelter to those who had nowhere else to go: the homeless, the lonely, those forgotten by society. She fed them, cared for them, helped them process documents. She did what no one else in this city wanted to do. When asked why her lodgers disappeared one by one, Dorothea merely shrugged. People moved away, found jobs in other cities, returned to relatives. These were former homeless people. They were by nature transient, here today, gone tomorrow, and the burials in the garden. Dorothea shook her head with a look of sincere bewilderment. She stated that she had no idea where they came from. The house was old, over 100 years old. Who knew what previous owners had buried there decades ago? Maybe it was an ancient historical burial site that happened quite often in California. Cabrera slowly laid photographs on the table, shots of the excavations, remains wrapped in sheets and plastic, empty sedative packages, a coffee grinder with traces of flurazepam. Dorothea looked at the photographs and shrugged again. She calmly said that the sheets could have belonged to anyone, that she bought the sedative for lodgers who actually suffered from insomnia, that she used the coffee grinder exclusively for coffee, not for anything illegal. For every question, she had a prepared answer. Calm, rational, almost convincing. She didn't raise her voice, didn't get nervous, and didn't get tangled in her testimony. Years of practice had taught her to lie as naturally as breathing. Detective Brown asked about the money, about the checks that continued to arrive in the names of the missing lodgers, about the signatures someone put on those checks, about the accounts into which funds were regularly deposited. Dorothea did not deny the financial side of the matter. Yes, she received money for her lodgers, but it was legal. She was their official guardian. She spent those funds on their maintenance, food, clothing, medicine. According to her, she only took what she was entitled to for the hard work, no crime. And the fact that she continued to receive checks after people had supposedly left. Dorothea explained this as typical bureaucratic confusion. Social services work slowly. By the time they update their databases, by the time they redirect payments to a new address, months pass. She was simply setting that money aside, supposedly intending to hand it over to the owners when they turned up. Cabrera listened to this with a stony face. He realized Dorothea was stalling. It was time to play the trump card. The detective took the toxicological expert's report out of a folder and placed it before Dorothea. He waited for her to read the text. The document was written in dry, scientific language, but the essence remained perfectly clear. Fluorazepam was found in the remains of several victims in concentrations many times higher than the therapeutic dose. The amount of the drug was sufficient to cause respiratory arrest in a healthy adult. For weakened elderly people, such a dose was fatal. Cabrera asked point blank how Dorothea would explain the presence of critical doses of sedative in the bodies of people who, according to her, had simply moved away to stay with relatives. For the first time in the multi-hour interrogation, the smile disappeared from Dorothea's face. She stared at the document in silence. Then she raised her eyes to the detective. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. Not warm and welcoming, but cold, absolutely level. She said she would no longer answer questions, that she needed a lawyer, that she had the right to remain silent and intended to exercise that right immediately. The interrogation was terminated at 14:43. Now the investigation had to dig further, to identify every victim, to reconstruct the chronology of events, to find witnesses who might have seen or heard something suspicious, and most importantly, to understand if Dorothea Puente's bloody trail stretched even further back into the past, beyond the house on F Street. The results came on November 28th, exactly 5 days after the exhumation. Dr. Beatty called Cabrera personally, not trusting such information to ordinary communication channels. What he had discovered changed the whole case. Ruth Monroe had lain in the ground for 6.5 years. In that time, only bones and fragments of hair remained of her, but that proved sufficient. Fluorazepam, the same drug found in the remains of the F Street victims. The concentration was lower, many years had passed, after all, but high enough to completely rule out therapeutic use. Ruth Monroe had not just taken a sleeping pill before passing. She had taken a dose that was guaranteed to shut her down forever. In 1982, the investigation decided Ruth had left on her own terms. A codeine overdose against a backdrop of depression after the loss of her husband, a logical, understandable story. No one looked for other substances in her body then because there were no grounds for it. Now there were grounds, and they pointed to one specific person. Cabrera pulled all the materials on the Ruth Monroe case, interrogation transcripts, witness statements, financial documents. He read them anew, already knowing what investigators 6 years ago did not. The picture was painfully familiar. Dorothea met Ruth in early 1982. She presented herself as a caring neighbor who wanted to help a lonely widow. She began visiting, cooking food, cleaning the apartment. Ruth was infinitely grateful. After the passing of her husband, she was left all alone. The friendship developed rapidly. Within a month, Dorothea was managing part of Ruth's finances, helping pay bills, buying groceries, keeping the household books. 2 months later, Ruth transferred $3,000 to her officially through a notary as a thank you for the care. 2 weeks after that, Ruth was found in her apartment without signs of life. Dorothea was the sole witness to Ruth's final days. She told the police about her friend's depression, about her talk of not wanting to live, about insomnia and constant health complaints. Investigators accepted this version without question then. Why doubt the words of a caring neighbor? But now Cabrera saw this story differently. Dorothea didn't just befriend Ruth. She worked her. She built up the image of a person in deep depression just in case something went wrong. She prepared the ground for an explanation that would not cause suspicion. And then, once all the documents were signed and the money received, she disposed of her friend using the same method she would later apply to the lodgers of the boarding house. Sedatives in food or drinks, a quiet passing in her sleep, no traces, no struggle, no witnesses. In 1982, the scheme worked perfectly. Ruth's passing was written off as a personal decision, and Dorothea got the money and the experience. Experience she would later use again and again. Cabrera compiled the chronology. Ruth Monroe, April 82. Then several years in prison for fraud. Then release and the opening of the boarding house on F Street in the mid-80s. And then the systematic disappearance of lodgers that continued until November 88. But between Ruth and the boarding house, there was something else. Everson Gilmuth, a 67-year-old retiree whom Dorothea met in 1986, shortly after her release from prison. They planned to marry. Everson even changed his will in her favor. And then he was found in the Sacramento River, in a wooden box, with substances in his system that could not be identified at the time. The case was closed as an accident or an unidentified crime. Dorothea was questioned, but no grounds for charges were found. She received part of his savings according to the will and continued her life. Now Cabrera understood. It was no accident. It was another episode of the same series. Only this time, Dorothea disposed of the victim in a different way. Perhaps because Everson was larger and stronger than her previous targets, or she was experimenting with methods of concealment. The investigation requested materials on the Gilmuth case. No, here a problem arose. He had been cremated shortly after being found. No remains existed for analysis anymore. The only evidence of Dorothea's involvement remained circumstantial. Financial gain, a familiar signature, and suspicious timing. Dorothea Puente had not been committing her crimes since 1985, when she opened the boarding house. She had started significantly earlier, at least since 82, possibly even earlier. Ruth Monroe might not have been the first victim, but simply the first that could be linked to Dorothea. Cabrera ordered a check on all suspicious cases in Puente's circle over the last 20 years. The task was titanic. Hundreds of archive files needed to be pulled, many of which had long since been destroyed or lost. At the same time, work continued on identifying the remains from F Street. By early December, the identities of all 7 people found in the garden were established: Leona Carpenter, Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, James Gallup, Vera Faye Martin, Betty Palmer, Alvaro Montoya, the one whose disappearance had launched the investigation. Each of them had their own story, their own life, however difficult, their own hopes, however modest. They all came to F Street looking for a roof over their heads and human warmth. They all trusted a woman who seemed the embodiment of kindness, and they all ended their journey in shallow pits under her rose bushes. Cabrera understood to build an ironclad case. He needed more than expertise and financial documents. He needed testimony. He needed witnesses, and ideally a confession from Dorothea herself. For now, she was silent, sheltered behind a wall of lawyers. But the detective knew even the strongest walls sometimes crack, especially when a person finally realizes there is no way out. The crack appeared, but not at all where Cabrera expected to see it. Not in Dorothea's testimony, or in her confession during interrogation. It appeared at her own lawyer's press conference, becoming the first move in a complex legal game where the stake was the defendant's life. Kevin Klimo was an experienced defender. He specialized in the most difficult criminal cases and had a reputation as a man who was not afraid to take on absolutely hopeless situations. When he was appointed to represent Dorothea Puente's interests, many in Sacramento's legal community merely shook their heads sympathetically. The case looked lost before the trial even began. Too many victims, too clear a motive. But Klimo had no intention of giving up without a fight. On December 5th, 1988, he called journalists to the district court building. Cameras, microphones, dozens of reporters with notebooks, all of California's press, turned out to hear what the defense of the year's most talked about grandmother would say. What Klimo stated caught everyone off guard. He did not deny that Dorothea gave her lodgers medications. He did not claim she had nothing to do with their deaths. Instead, he chose a completely different, paradoxical line of defense. According to Klimo, his client was merely an incompetent caregiver, a woman with good intentions, but without the slightest medical education. She sincerely wanted to help her charges, many of whom had suffered for years from insomnia, anxiety, and chronic pain. She gave them sedatives to ease their suffering, but simply did not know how to correctly calculate a dangerous dosage. Tragic accidents, not crimes. Klimo emphasized that his client never had the intent to cause anyone harm. She cared for people whose society had long since written off. She gave them a home, food, human warmth, what no one else wanted to give. That some of them passed away under her roof was a sad coincidence and the result of medical ignorance, not the result of cold, evil intent. As for the burials in the garden, Klimo offered an explanation for that too. Dorothea was supposedly deathly afraid that the authorities would immediately close her boarding house if they found out what had happened. She knew that many of her lodgers had no relatives who could organize a normal funeral. She knew that without money, their remains would simply be sent to a common, unmarked grave in the city cemetery, and she made a decision controversial, perhaps illegal, but dictated by a distorted sense of care to bury them on her plot, where she could continue to watch over them. The journalists listened with their mouths open. It was a bold, almost offensive attempt to completely rewrite the bloody history of F Street. But from a legal perspective, it was the only possible defense strategy. Klimo understood he could not argue with facts. Remains were found, sedatives were discovered in them, financial documents were seized. The only thing that could be contested was intent. The difference between first-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter. The difference between the death penalty and a few years in prison. If the jurors believed that Dorothea was just an incompetent but kind-hearted woman who accidentally harmed those she wanted to help. If they saw her not as a cold-blooded serial predator, but as a tragic figure, a victim of her own ignorance, then the entire first-degree murder charge would fall apart. Cabrera watched the broadcast of this press conference from his office. With every word Klimo spoke, his fists clenched tighter. He had studied this woman's biography too well. He saw patterns that left no room for ambiguity. An accidental overdose once, maybe twice. No 9 people over several years. With the same method, with the same financial motive, with a thorough, almost professional concealment of traces. This was not negligence. This was a system. But the detective understood the problem. Proving intent is a monumental task in criminal law. Direct evidence is needed: a confession, eyewitness testimony, or documentary confirmation of planning. The prosecution had a sea of circumstantial evidence, but not a single direct proof that Dorothea consciously wanted to harm her lodgers. Climo's press conference set the tone for the entire future trial. The defense was not going to argue with facts, it was going to reinterpret them. To turn the story of a serial criminal into a drama about a tragic mistake, playing on the jury's sympathy for an elderly woman who had spent her life helping the disadvantaged. The prosecution needed something to counter this cynical strategy. For the next few weeks, Cabrera's team worked on strengthening the evidentiary base. They looked for witnesses who could confirm Dorothea's awareness of the drug's effects. They found a pharmacist from a local drugstore who remembered that Puente had repeatedly questioned him about the dosages and side effects of flurazepam. He had even directly warned her about the danger of exceeding the recommended dose, especially for elderly patients. A former lodger of the boarding house, who had moved out a year before the excavations, recounted that Dorothea always insisted that residents take any medication only from her hands. She did not allow them to control their own medication intake, explaining this as care, saying old people are forgetful. They might miss a pill or take an extra one. A social worker who oversaw several of the victims testified that Dorothea was actively interested in the size of their benefits even before they moved into the boarding house. She asked questions about payment dates, about the transfer procedure, about what happens to the money if the recipient passes away. Individually, each of these testimonies could be explained by innocent reasons. Together, they painted a picture of a person who knew exactly what they were doing, who planned, who calculated. But would this be enough to convince 12 jurors? Cabrera understood something else was needed, something that would shatter the kind grandmother image for good, and that something was found in the most unexpected place, in the letters Dorothea wrote from prison to an acquaintance. Letters that the investigation obtained by entirely legal means, revealing her true face, stripped of its mask. The letters proved to be a gold mine, but before using them in court, the prosecution needed to construct a visual picture of the crimes, one that any juror would understand, even those who had never dealt with criminal cases. Prosecutor John O'Mara commissioned a forensic reconstruction. Specialists from the county lab created a detailed three-dimensional model of the house on F Street and the adjacent plot. Every room, every flower bed, every square meter of the garden, everything was recreated to the centimeter based on photographs and measurements. On the side plan, red dots marked the locations where remains were found. 7 dots scattered across the entire backyard, under the rose bushes by the east fence, under the tomato bed, in the center of the plot, under the decorative pond that Dorothea had installed in 1987, under a young plum tree in the far corner, under the concrete path leading to the shed. When all the dots were placed on the plan, something became visible that was impossible to notice at the excavation site. The burials were not located randomly. They formed a kind of system, as if someone had pre-planned where the next spot would be. Each new burial was as far as possible from the previous one. Each was camouflaged with something that required regular maintenance: flowers, vegetables, decorative elements. Dorothea was not just hiding the traces of her crimes. She was creating reasons to regularly appear near each burial site, to water the flowers, to weed the beds, to monitor the condition of the soil. If the earth began to sink or a smell began to break through, she would be the first to notice. Forensics prepared an animation demonstrating a typical crime cycle. This was not an artistic reconstruction, only diagrams, arrows, and timestamps. No, even in such a dry form, it made a strong impression. The 6 stages of Dorothea Puente's business. Stage 1. Appearance of a new victim. An arrow on the diagram showed the path from social services to the front door of house number 1426. A person arrived by referral, usually homeless, lonely, without family or friends. Dorothea met them with a smile, showed them their room, fed them a hot lunch. First contact, building trust. Stage 2. Financial capture. This usually took from 2 to 4 weeks. Dorothea helped the lodger process documents for social benefits or re-register existing ones to the new address. She became their official representative. She gained access to bank accounts, the right to sign checks, and control over all financial operations. Stage 3. Period of exploitation. This could last from several months to several years. While the victim was alive, Dorothea received money for their maintenance, part officially as payment for lodging and food, part unofficially, simply by misappropriating funds that were supposed to go to the lodger's personal needs. She made from $300 to $500 a month on each resident. Stage 4. Liquidation. The moment came when the victim became a burden, too sick, demanding, or curious. On the diagram, this looked like a dot moving from the living area to the kitchen. There, Dorothea prepared the Last Supper, grinding fluorazepam pills in a coffee grinder. The victim ate the poisoned food, felt drowsy, and went to their room. By morning, it was all over. Stage 5. Concealment. The animation showed movement from the house to the backyard. Always at night, neighbors confirmed they sometimes heard the sounds of digging after midnight. Dorothea dug a pit, laid the victim in it, covered them with lime, buried them, and camouflaged the spot with fresh plantings. The whole process took no more than 12 hours. Stage 6. Continued receipt of payments. The most cynical stage. On the diagram, the arrows of cash flow did not stop after the victim's disappearance. Checks continued to arrive. Dorothea continued to cash them, forging signatures and responding to social services inquiries that the lodger simply couldn't come to the phone. Benjamin Fink officially received benefits right up until November 1988, even though he had been buried under a garden bed since summer. Dorothy Miller was listed as alive for almost 2 years after her actual disappearance. The system worked like clockwork. Prosecutor O'Mara planned to use this reconstruction as a central element of the prosecution. It visually refuted the defense's version of accidental overdoses. Accidents do not create systems. Accidents are not accompanied by thorough concealment of evidence and the continuation of financial machinations. What Dorothea Puente was doing was a business, cold, calculating, built on human lives. She treated her victims as a resource to be exploited as efficiently as possible. The reconstruction was ready by mid-January 1989, but the trial was still a long way off. The case was too complex. The defense demanded additional expertise and contested the evidence. And Dorothea, meanwhile, sat in her cell and wrote letters in which the true face of the woman, playing the role of a miserable victim, began to show through. The contents of these letters were the final nail in the coffin for the defense's position. Dorothea complained to an acquaintance about the injustice of the accusations, but between the lines, Something else slipped through: cold calculation, a complete lack of remorse and contempt for the victims. She called them a burden, useless mouths, people who were unwanted anyway. The court began its work in February 1993, more than 4 years after the arrest. That much time was spent on preparing the case, complex expertise, and endless legal maneuvers by the defense. The Monterey County courtroom was packed to capacity. The case had been moved from Sacramento to Salinas to find impartial jurors. In Dorothea's hometown, too many people knew the shocking details from the press. Prosecutor John O'Mara began the trial by listing names: Leona Carpenter, Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, James Gallup, Vera Faye Martin, Betty Palmer, Alvaro Montoya, Ruth Monroe, Everson Gilmuth. 9 people, 9 lives cut short for social checks. For the next 5 months, the jury listened to testimony. Social workers recounted how Dorothea systematically gained control over her lodger's finances. Forensics demonstrated the results of toxicological reports. Neighbors remembered the nightly sounds of digging and the strange, heavy smell they had attributed to fertilizer at the time. The defense stubbornly tried to present Dorothea as a victim of a difficult childhood and an incompetent caregiver who made a mistake. But the letters from prison finally shattered this image. When the prosecutor read excerpts where she called her lodgers useless trash, a deathly silence hung in the courtroom. Dorothea sat motionless, with that same soft smile she'd worn her whole life as a mask. On August 10th, 1993, the jury delivered their verdict. Guilty on 3 counts with special circumstances, first degree. On the other 6, the jurors could not reach a unanimous decision, although they later confessed to journalists that privately they had no doubt of her involvement in all 9 cases. The prosecution demanded the death penalty, but the 12 jurors' votes were split in California. Such a sentence required a unanimous decision. 2 jurors refused to vote for the death penalty, considering life imprisonment a sufficient punishment for a 64-year-old woman. Judge Michael Verga announced the final sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Dorothea Puente would spend the rest of her days behind bars at Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. She listened to the sentence with the same impenetrable calm with which she had met the police on her porch 5 years earlier. No tears, no remorse, not a single word addressed to the victims and their families. The death house landlady was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, but the story did not end there. Questions remained for which Dorothea never gave answers until the very end. House number 1426 on F Street stood empty and boarded up for several years after the trial. Enclosed by a fence, it gradually fell into disrepair, but still survived. Contrary to all rumors of demolition, the building was restored. Today, it remains Sacramento's darkest residential landmark. Locals still avoid it, and tourists continue to come to take photos against the backdrop of the house where mercy once turned into a nightmare. There are no memorials on the facade, no plaques with the names of the victims. The building stands as a silent reminder of the past, a dark spot in the history of a quiet street that cannot be painted over with fresh paint. The Dorothea Puente case revealed systemic problems in the work of social services. After the trial, new rules were adopted for monitoring payments to lonely and elderly people, mandatory personal visits, cross-checks, stricter procedures for appointing guardians, but officials admitted the system is still vulnerable. People without families and connections remain easy prey for those who want to take advantage of their helplessness. Dorothea spent 18 years in the Chowchilla prison. During that time, she gave several interviews to journalists. In none of them did she express remorse. She continued to insist on her innocence. She said she had been framed, that the evidence was fabricated, and that she only wanted to help people. Until her final day, she played the role of a sweet grandmother who had become a victim of injustice. On March 27th, 2011, Dorothea Puente passed away. She died in the prison hospital from natural causes. She was 82 years old. The exact number of her victims remains unknown. 3 episodes were officially proven. The investigation was certain of 9. But how many people actually passed through her hands over the decades, no one will ever know. Their names are forgotten. Their burials are unmarked plots in the Sacramento City Cemetery. People whom society did not notice in life remained unnoticed after their passing, and the roses on F Street have long since faded.